So Tim, when I talk to people these days and they ask me what I'm doing, and I say I'm making synthwave music with my friend Tim, the first question they ask me is, "What's a synthesizer?" Right?
Yes.
So what is a synthesizer?
I mean, it's so funny that it's probably one of the most important instruments in any song that you've heard in the last 60 years, because synthesizers have been widely used for a very, very long time in popular music and in songs that have become, internationally very, very successful. But you can't, I mean, when you describe it to somebody, it's like, well, is it a piano? And it's like, no, it's not a piano. It's it's an electronic instrument, right?
It's also responsible for a bunch of movie effects like R2-D2's beeps and boops. I'm sure countless other effects as well.
Absolutely. So when it comes to saying what a synthesizer is, it's like I always kind of answer in a somewhat facetious tone where it's basically, it's like, that song, that part of that song that you love, it's that thing in that
making
song,
the noise.
making the thing that makes that song what it is. That's what a synthesizer is. So but if you want a little bit more technical explanation, so synthesizers come in many different forms, and you have digital synthesizers, but the original synthesizers actually were, well, it depends on how you want to look at it, I guess, but the original synthesizers in terms of the modern sense of the instrument were analog synthesizers that used electronic components like oscillators and amplifiers and so on to take an electrical waveform and turn it into sound.
And essentially you modulate it with voltage and other electrical means as opposed to digitally, right? The analog versus the digital synthesizers.
Correct.
Essentially, we have all analog synthesizers that we use, but some people use the digital counterpart of our analog synthesizers in their music through the digital, the DAW, right?
Right.
The workstation.
So with let's just start off by talking. There's so much that we can talk about with respect to how to set up a synthesizer studio and other things like that. But I think that to start off our conversation, we should really just get straight what a synthesizer does.
Yeah.
So it puts out a waveform. One of the things that you are able to do with this waveform is to change the sound by essentially subtracting harmonics from the waveform, which allows you to come up with brand new noises. It's almost like if you think about writing a piece for a symphony where you have acoustic instruments that have physical parts to them that make noise. So a piano, for example, is a percussion instrument with strings in it, and the hammers, when you hit the keys on a piano, it physically moves components inside the piano that smash against strings and make noise in an acoustic fashion. An acoustic guitar, you're strumming it, and the hollow body of the guitar picks up the resonance of the strings and projects it. With the synthesizer, it doesn't itself make noise unless it's plugged into an amplifier that is able to send that signal into sound waves, which the first acoustic part of a synthesizer only happens after it's already gone through your monitor speakers. So they're different, and then like you have samples too, which is a whole other thing.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, to give you an idea, Tim was talking about waveforms and subtracting harmonics to create different voices with them. You can also add together different waveforms together initially, right?
Correct.
And then subtract them. For example, that's what a sawtooth wave sounds like. This is a triangle wave. This is a square wave. So like they each have their kind of timbre and characteristics, and you can combine them together. For example, here is a sawtooth wave combined with a triangle wave. So it sounds a little bit different now.
Yes, it's an amazing feature of synthesizers that have more than one oscillator, and some synthesizers have sub-oscillators, which allows you to play in unison more than one oscillator on a single track. But they're really amazing instruments, and you can, if what I was going to say earlier with a symphony, when you're writing for an orchestra, you're limited to the instruments that you have in your orchestra. So you have a string section with violas and cellos and violins, and then you have a horn section with trombones and French horns and so on. You got woodwinds with flutes and clarinets and oboes and bassoons. But with a synthesizer, you're writing to a literal infinite amount of potential symphonic parts, and when you add multiple synthesizers into your studio setup, it allows you to use different synthesizers to create different harmonic voices within the piece that you're creating.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's essentially what we've been doing for our music. Each track is almost a separate hardware synthesizer with its own unique voice. I mean, we could, if we wanted to, create all of our music just from one synthesizer, right?
Sure.
But like any instrument, you know, not every guitar sounds the same, even though they're made up of the same components.
Right.
And the same is true with synthesizers. Some of these old school synthesizers from the 70s just have a certain characteristic to them because of their components, and you can't recreate it with a modern day digital synthesizer or otherwise.
I think that it would probably be worth our time to talk a little bit about that. Now, I think it would be easy for somebody to look at what we're doing and say, oh, well, these guys have some money, they're able to invest into instruments. And I think it's easy when you're in the position that we are to look at what we have and say, oh, well, I don't want to deal with any software synthesizers, and kind of poo-poo or trash software synthesizers. And I hesitate to do that, because although for me, I would prefer not to be dealing with a digital layout where I'm manipulating the sound through a software mouse keyboard situation. Yeah. I don't want to do that. I would rather be twisting the knobs on a physical keyboard, plus having a physical, and you can do this with a MIDI keyboard actually. So if you had a MIDI keyboard that actually doesn't even have any oscillators in it, you can hook that up to your computer and play and manipulate with a MIDI keyboard. So I'm maybe not being entirely fair to software synthesizers, but I know people who use software synthesizers, and a lot of that has to do with, you know, finances dictating the fact that you can really, if you're interested in dabbing your toe into or dabbling in the world of synthesis, you know, you can really easily get into it by downloading some, they're called VSTs, virtual software synthesizer tracks, and use those and toy around with them and get an idea for how to manipulate waveforms.
Right. You know, I started out last year not knowing anything about synthesis, even though I have a background in music, as do you, and you know, I understand the layout of a keyboard. I had no idea how synthesis worked until I bought this little Korg mini log, it's like a $500 synthesizer.
Right. Which, for what it can do, is an amazing value,
yes,
I feel.
100%. And, you know, I learned best from, like, tactile, physical sensations and stuff like that. And so, you know, watching YouTube and learning about synthesis is a good way to start if you are interested in this type of music. Definitely
so. I think that even if you were to purchase, it doesn't take a fortune to get into this. So my first keyboard that I purchased was the Juno G, which we've been happily able to incorporate into some of the songs that we've been writing recently, which is funny because it's an instrument from 2006. You could probably pick one up today for about $300-400. But I think that you and I we were toying around on it yesterday because it has this whole. So the Juno G is a little bit different than some of the other ones because it's the only synthesizer that we have that actually uses digital samples to create its noise. It doesn't actually have oscillators in it. It's all done digitally. However, it's an amazing instrument. And so even though it's 14 years old and you can pick one up for much less than you could, like, say, a saxophone or something like that, you can do so much with it. It's a really versatile instrument, and we've found uses for it, even though, you know, of the instruments, I would say it's probably the least, like,
It's the least sexy for
It's
sure.
the least sexy of them all by a long shot. You know.
If we're talking about sexiness factor, the Prophet and the Cat are definitely up there.
Yeah, I would agree. The Cat, it doesn't get sexier than the Cat.
No.
We have one of the synths that we have in the studio I purchased recently. It's a vintage synthesizer called Octave the Cat SRM2. And I've wanted one for years and years and years, but just never had the guts to actually go out and buy one. Plus, they're kind of hard to find. So, but this dude in Burbank was selling, and I picked it up, and I have been. I mean, we always get a charge out of it. It's quite a thing.
I mean, it's. We're talking about the kind of characteristics of old hardware, and this thing is a little finicky. It'll just make, when you turn it on, it'll make a weird noise, and it'll just make random weird noises sometimes outside of your control.
Yep. And
maybe the next time you turn it on, it won't be tuned anymore.
No.
But it's all part of the aesthetic.
It really is. It's got quirks to it that give it a lot of character, and you can't leave it on while you're recording other tracks because it buzzes and hums and makes all this horrible noise that you don't want in your track. But it's still a lot of fun to play around with. So let's talk a little bit more about. We've been talking a lot about synthesizers and kind of how they work, but maybe we could go into a little bit about like the direction that we're going with our synthesizers and the creative process that we.
Okay, so the creative process is really interesting to me, actually. Tim and I collaborate really well. There's not too much ego or fighting involved, and the product that we're able to make from that is something way beyond the sum of its parts, and it's way beyond something us as individuals could have made.
I completely agree. We were talking earlier, and I wanted to mention this actually because I've had people already ask me about like, what part do you play in this group, or what instrument are you? And it's like, the way that Henry and I go about creating music is, it's not ownership over any individual part. Like, no. Whether it's Henry or I playing the synthesizer, we switch back and forth. At any given time, I don't even know I would be able to tell you which one of us is playing a part. I would have to like really think about it. But like we both have input on what's being played and give each other suggestions, and sometimes we'll both be manipulating it because as you're playing something, see, we record everything live, and so when we're playing things, it's because it's actually physically being played in our environment, and we are recording that live to a track. And so if you hear modulations of sounds, it's probably in some cases because Henry is actually physically playing the keyboard of it, and I'm modulating the sound for him as he's playing it.
Right, so there's two ways that we could have gone about it, and we've done it both ways. We could have recorded MIDI,
right.
Which is essentially a language, so the computer knows what notes you're playing, translates that into these lines, and so we could have recorded in MIDI and then use that MIDI to record the audio and modulate it post. What we've been doing more and more is straight up recording the live audio from the instrument with the live modulation, so what you hear is in real time. It's
in real time, and what I really like about that is that although it's less precise in some ways, because with MIDI you can quantize everything. So what quantizing means is when you're playing music in a particular metronome beats per minute setting, when you quantize something, it makes it so that every note that you play is exactly on beat to, say, the nearest 16th note or the nearest 8th note or even the nearest like 32nd note, and you can set it to whatever you want, but basically it means that everything is completely snapped into the grid of the time signature that you're playing in and the tempo that you're playing in. And that's a really clever way of going about having your instrument play and then you be able to modulate the sound of the instrument as it's basically playing for you. But I kind of enjoy the fact that with Henry and I, we've been, because the live tracks are recorded as we're actually physically playing the instrument, it's not quite perfect. It's something that's just, and I doubt that you and I could even replicate it a second time to be exactly the same, but in some sense that's almost kind of the beauty of it. Mm-hmm. Is it's like this happened, it was a glimpse in that moment in time, and we managed to fit it all together.
Yeah, the music isn't necessarily quote unquote perfect,
right,
from a musical theory standpoint, but it sounds good to us.
Right.
And so what I think is cool about our process is that each song that we work on almost takes on a life of its own, and it has its own deterministic conclusion. You know, there's certain songs and it just wants to go a certain direction outside of your intent and control. And so a lot of times, you know, we'll have like a foundation for a song, and then we'll be like, all right, this needs something. It needs like a little bit like a melody, but it has to sound, it has to cut through the bass because everything else is too noisy and sawtoothy. So we need something more triangly to cut through the sound, right? That's kind of a lot of our thought processes, and man, it's super fun and it's really rewarding, isn't it?
It really is. I think that you and I really look forward to the times where we're able to get together, you know, even throughout the week. So Henry and I, during the week, we won't actually hang out or see each other because, you know, I'm busy working, he lives a ways away, and so, but over the weekend we get together, and the weekends always go by super quick because we have, by the time that we reunite at the weekend, we've got, first of all, a million things to talk about, so we always end up talking for about 2 hours before we even get started making music. But we have all these ideas throughout the week that we've come up with, and it's like, you know, I love that idea. Here's something that I thought could go over it, or here's another thing I thought we could do to make it sound even cooler, or whatever. And I think that that's one of the cool things too about our process, is that there's no idea that's like that we're above trying.
No, absolutely. It's like stand-up, or rather improv. You always say yes, right?
Yeah.
And so the other thing is, I'm never married to any idea or riff. I always want Tim's opinion on it, and then it just becomes an amalgamation of both of our ideas.
Absolutely.
And it's, you know, there's like a serendipitous factor. Sometimes we'll be working on our own. We'll come up with our own ideas and riffs. We'll collaborate and combine again, and for some reason, they just serendipitously work together.
Yes.
Maybe you change the key at most.
Yeah.
But
absolutely. And I think that they make each other better too. Like the sum, the whole is a greater product than the sum of its parts, if that makes any sense.
It is. We have a similar musical aesthetic, but at the same time we hear things differently, and so it's like, you know, you may, and it's good because it's that other perspective. I can never make any of these songs by myself.
I couldn't either. And I'll say, you know, one of the other things that Henry and I were talking about, so recently, we've said this a million times, but we'll say it again. We recently went up to Oakland and saw this dude Lance at the Vintage Synthesizer Museum, and had such an outstanding time, and it was really cool to be able to not only learn more about how the process of manipulating a synthesizer works, but also too to be able to play on some just priceless, really, really rare vintage synthesizers.
Hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of synths.
Oh, it's amazing. I mean, this guy's studio is state of the art. So it was really cool. But we were talking at that deal there. So we went to a workshop, and Henry and I were 2 of 6 of the students that were there. And it, you know, we kind of came up with this understanding that, you know, synthesizers have a tendency, because it's very electronic and very computery, for lack of a better word, it does have a tendency to attract like computer programmer type people, because you kind of do need to use a computer, at least in modern times, in order to record. You don't need to, but it's just like the easiest way, I would say, of doing it is to hook all your stuff into a Mac and be able to just manipulate it. But because people who are savvy with computers and programming and other things, I think there's a natural tendency for them to be attracted to electronically produced music. And I would say one of the things that sets us a little bit apart is that our background really isn't in computers. I think that both you and I are functional with computers, but I would not say that we're like programmers by any stretch of the imagination. No. And so like our background is in music, and I think that we carry that into the stuff that we're making, because I think of it first from an oral, meaning like hearing standpoint, rather than how it would look on a computer screen.
The other thing I think that, I don't know if it sets us apart or not, but it's definitely something that we are keenly aware of, is composition and structure. Yes. Like for Arcade, for example, it follows the typical verse chorus, bridge chorus structure. Right. Not necessarily intentionally, but it just happened that way.
Yeah.
And that's fine. That's like a very standard construction.
It's a tried and true method of songwriting for years.
But when some of my friends were listening to it, they're like, they noticed the structure, which without that musical composition, you may have a really cool melody or a really cool riff, but it has to resolve somehow.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. I think the next direction I'd like to take things in terms of stuff is to talk a little bit about our setup. So we have a number of different synthesizers, and when you create a studio, if you're interested in doing something like this yourself, it requires you to purchase certain things that you're going to need in order to make everything work. So first of all, of course, you need instruments, right? So that goes without saying, is that you need some sort of synthesizer keyboard. Specifically, though, you're probably going to want one that you can hook in. There's different kinds of cables, but you're going to want to hook one into some kind of mixer. So if you have multiple instruments, like we do, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different synthesizers right now hooked up to a mixing board, and so all of them are on the same mixer, and that mixer then is hooked into something called a universal audio device. And what this essentially does is it's an analog digital converter, and it basically takes the signal, the acoustic signal or the digital signal being sent through the cable, and allows your computer to be able to interpret that noise, that analog signal, and record it as digital sound data on your computer. And so from the universal audio device, it goes into your computer, but also you need to have your computer hooked up to a set of monitors. So the way that we have it set up is that our universal audio device is both hooked into the computer and also hooked into monitors. When I say monitors, I'm not talking like a computer monitor. I'm talking about a speaker monitor, and that is what gives you your actual sound. And it will both play the instruments, and it will also play as you record the instruments.
I think we should talk a little bit about why music producers and studios, why they even use monitors, speakers, as opposed to your normal computer speakers or your normal home theater setup. And it's similar to the reason why graphic design artists also require a very specific computer and monitor palette. So the point is, you want a true representation of what you're creating when it translates to real life. So the musician wants to hear what the sounds actually sound like without any type of influence from the speaker hardware, and the design artist wants to know truly what his colors look like without any influence from the color of the monitor, computer monitor. And so but to be honest, even if you don't have monitors, because I don't have a pair of speaker monitors at home, so when I go work at home, I just use headphones, which is just as good. A good
set of headphones is just as good. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I just like making noise, and I don't like wearing headphones, so my neighbors hate me, but that's okay.
But yeah, so once we bounce some of these songs, we'll play them on multiple different environments, like Tim's home theater system, like a small speaker setup, headphones, because it's going to sound a little bit different in every single scenario. And of course, you can't make it perfect in every single scenario, but you just want like a good average.
Absolutely, that's exactly what I was going to say. Even in the car, I'll listen to it in the car and see how it sounds.
Too. Admittedly, our mastering could use some reworking.
We need some. That'll be our next workshop. I think is we're going to go to a mastering workshop to learn how to actually properly master our songs.
Yeah, I think that's It's harder than one would imagine, since there's so much stuff going on. We have at least maybe between 6 to 10 tracks per song. Like tracks meaning there's like 10 themes going on at once, and each one of those tracks have an automated volume control, meaning we've already adjusted it. So as the song progresses, the volume of each track will change based off of what we tell it to. And so
that is one of the cool features. By the way, what we're talking about right now is kind of the last component that we didn't mention, which is that you need a digital audio workstation, or
a DAW.
or a DAW as it's sometimes called. And there's all sorts of different DAWs. Some of them cheaper, some of them more expensive. We use Logic Pro 10, but there's Ableton Live, and there's all sorts of different things. And there's no right or wrong. Cubase is another one.
Pro Tools, which is a kind of old school one now. Funnily, it used to be the state of the art.
Yeah, and even like a simple one like GarageBand, you can actually do quite a bit with. Essentially, Logic's just an advanced version of GarageBand.
Correct. Yeah.
So.
And dude, Audacity is free.
Yes.
We used to use that to record all of our podcasts.
Right.
That's
a whole other story we won't get into. That's been a nightmare
suffice it
this
to
morning.
say, there's a lot of free software out there that you can take advantage of.
And some of them are, there's no right or wrong one. There's just kind of preference, right?
Yeah, it's all about the graphical user interface, the GUI.
That's true. Well, folks, we won't take up too much of your time today, but we wanted to take a few minutes to talk to you a little bit about introducing us and synthesizers and kind of the things that we've been thinking about lately and wanted to share with you guys. And what we would love to have you do is, if you enjoyed our little conversation here, make a comment, ask us questions, or even suggest new topics for us to talk about in the future.
100%, yeah. I'd be interested to see what people are curious about, and we don't necessarily have the answer, but we could find it.
But to be honest, it doesn't even necessarily have to be about synthesizers. If you get Henry and I going on anything, we can basically talk till the cows come home. So, hey, just shoot us a topic, and we'd be happy to elucidate for you.
All right, sounds good.
All right, guys. Till next time.